Hello and welcome to Hop Along Studio. In today's video, I wanted to share with you how you can use just your regular printed napkin in your art journal or in your art projects. There's a lot of ways you can use these to add textures and layers to your projects. So let's get started. So when we're looking for napkins for our projects, the one thing to think about is coming up with something that has a really nice design. There's a lot of napkins out there that I personally wouldn't use in my work, but really I just look for napkins that have really nice patterns, have really nice art, and again, these can be found at your grocery store, really any home decor store, lots of places that sell any sort of fun, really unique napkins can be used in this project. So the first thing that we want to do is actually take these apart to use them in our art. And a lot of these ones are 2 or 3 ply depending on the napkin themselves. It depends on what is on the package. And to take these apart, my suggestion is use 2 pieces of masking tape. And this will help you just touch the corner very gently because you don't want to tear these. And you use the tape itself to just very gently peel the first layer off. And you don't want to rip really fast. You want to go a little bit slowly because you don't want to rip the napkin as you're trying to take it apart. And these extra layers of napkin I hold on to because you can stamp on them, you can put different designs on them, and they're a really nice thickness for adding into your art journal projects. And so that was just one of the 2 layers. So you can see it's already getting a bit thinner than it was, but I want to go and remove another layer. To make sure that I don't damage the napkin, again, you want to touch it only a little bit on the front of it, and this additional piece on the back you can pull a little bit harder on. And now that I've taken them apart, I'm getting rid of my masking tape, and then you can see how these very gentle layers, you just need to pull them apart gently. And again, all of that kind of texture along the edge there is to help the napkin actually stay together. So now that we're trying to remove it, don't move too quickly, just take a little bit of time and pull them apart. And what you'll notice with this napkin is the second one has a bit of a ghost image. You can see some of the printing that came through from the first one onto the second layer. And that could make a very interesting layer in your project as well. Or you can also continue to add other color to it before adding it into your art journal or onto your projects. But this is our piece of napkin now. We've taken 2 layers off and we're just left with a very thin image layer. And here's another example of another napkin that I've already removed the back from. So you can see they come in a lot of different designs, and that's something to think about when you are choosing your napkin and how you're tearing it apart. Is, for example, this napkin, if you open it up, it has the image and then it's flipped on the other side. So with ones like this, before I would actually start taking the layers apart, I would cut it around here so that I can take the layers apart and I don't have to worry about trying to take a very thin layer like this and trying to cut it apart without ripping or tearing or damaging it. So that's generally how I manage this. So something to think about in your napkins. Some napkins are basically one overall image, like this one here that I've used before, where it's basically one large image that is across the entire napkin. Or you have ones like this that have 2 images, and you have other ones that will have every square has its own image. So something to be aware of when you're choosing a napkin about what you're looking to do with it, and that will probably dictate which style you take and which type of napkin you put on your project. So I wanted to show you how you can add just 1 layer onto your art journal page. And from here, I'll show you a few different iterations of this process as well. But basically, the basic process for adding the napkin to the art journal is using a brush. And you want a larger brush. I prefer a larger brush, actually. And I prefer something that has a lot more give to the bristles. That'll prevent you from damaging the napkin. I'm also going to be using some matte medium. You want to use a medium that is quite fluid, either matte or a gloss medium. So I would stay away from anything that is too thick. You want a very thin medium when adding this to your page. So there's 2 different ways you can do this. Some people will add some medium down below and then add some on top. And depending on your napkin, your technique, and how gentle you are, sometimes this isn't totally necessary. In my case, I tend to try to be a lot more gentle just as I work on top. And if you have enough medium on your brush, it'll absorb through. Because most napkins are multiple layers because they're meant to take some absorption. But this is, again, a personal preference. if you think you're finding it difficult just to add the medium down and you want to put some underneath, it's not a bad way of working. And so you want to work in small areas. In this case, I feel like the more I add below, the less bubbles and wrinkles I'm getting. So if you're really concerned about bubbles and wrinkles, this is a good way of very gently adding it. And again, you don't want to press hard. The whole point of this is to let the brush and the medium do the work for you. So when I was first learning this technique, I was a little heavy-handed with my brush, and I ended up ruining some of my napkins and tearing them. And it's very easy to tear these napkins if you're not careful. And you always want to work in little sections. You need to be a little bit patient with this. But I love the amazing results you can get just from adding a little bit of medium and adding your napkin to go below. And I'm finding, I've been playing with this a while, so I'm finding that generally by adding the medium below, you get a little bit better result, as long as you're gentle enough with your napkin. And you want to be fairly liberal with your matte medium as well. You don't want to go stingy on this stuff. You want to basically let as much of it soak in so that you end up with a really good final finish. You just continue to do that until you work your way up in sections up the entire napkin. In one place here, you might have noticed I went back over. Don't go back over areas. You need to put your medium down and then leave it, because in here actually, it's hard to see, but I do have a slight buckling where I slightly tore the napkin. So notice up here you end up with a really strong line. I wanted to show you how you can tear around the subject so that you end up having a much more feathered line than a really strong line like this. So when it comes to tearing napkins, there's a lot of different ways you can do it. One is just taking the corner and very gently tearing. But what I find is sometimes it's hard to control which fibers it's tearing, and you can end up with very jagged lines. And so for very detailed subjects like this, I do not generally tear by just tearing the paper. Even though you can, because I find that I really would prefer to get rid of some of the white here and start having a better line around there, but it's very hard to control. So instead what I do is take a very fine brush and a little bit of water. You don't want to have too much water in your brush, but you want to have enough water that it does soak into the napkin. And then what you want to do is you want to touch around it. And you'll notice as I touch around it, it actually gets much closer to the edge. And this is where you need to try to be careful how much water you're controlling. And that's why I usually try not to have too much in my brush. But by going around it with your brush, and again, you could get even closer than this. I'm just choosing not to today. Then you can gently go in. And in this case, because it's only a white background and I don't plan to use it for anything, you can very gently tear back the paper. And I'd probably just tear gently and not roll it like I have if I was actually looking to use it some of the other parts of the napkin, but in this case, because it's just a white background, I do not care to keep it. And you just go again, you go around and you gently tear, and that's a way you can get very close to the edge and pull out images without making a mess in your tearing. And if you get a little bit too far in like I did there, the other option is you just very carefully with your paintbrush pull it so that you don't end up tearing it where you don't want it to tear, and you're good. So the next thing I want to show you is what happens when you want to add these to a more colored background. So now I have my really small dragonflies, and this is quite a vivid background. I've just been cleaning my brushes out on it. I haven't done anything special with it. But let's say you want to add these dragonflies. Let's see what they look like. So I'm going to go back to grabbing my matte medium and my brush. And these ones specifically, I'm going to add some matte medium to the area that they're going to go down. You just need to be very careful when applying these because again they're quite small pieces and you don't want to damage them. So you can see even my technique, I'm more loading my brush, letting it absorb into the paper and pulling once. And that's a way you're going to prevent wrecking the paper. But now you can see that now that I have added that, it doesn't have a very strong line. It doesn't have that really strong line across it anymore. It's a very subtle line because you tore the paper. And that's something to think about when you're adding tissue paper to pretty much anything, is to make sure that you have a tear over a really straight line. Unless you're going to take the time to cut out every detail to the very edge, I would suggest making sure that you tear instead. And for this one, because I didn't add a layer, and you will notice on this side it's a little less smooth. And now that I've added a little bit there, that is a bit smoother. And so you definitely get a much smoother look when you add the medium first and then add your napkin. And so you'll notice that with these two, when you look at the original napkin, that's quite a bright colored dragonfly. This one's quite a bit more muted. So it picks up the color underneath it. So it's something to be really aware of when you're choosing the surface for this, that you are aware that the more color that you have, the more muted your tissue paper is going to be, just because of the fact that it is it's partially transparent when you add it on. But then areas like this, where it's a little bit lighter, you can again see it a little bit better. So I want to show you an example of what happens when you use this on black. In this case, I added a sunflower. It's a sunflower from this group, and you can see that by putting on a black background, it very much disappears. You can't really tell very much. You can tell it's a flower shape, but it's not a very clear flower shape. I also added the one with a darker background, because this one has a very white, light background. This has a lot more color in it, so I thought, well, maybe this will stick out a little bit better. And it did to an extent. The areas here, I actually put a second layer on, which is why you can see their color a little bit more distinctly. But again, it's a very muted color. But taking all those layers off, even though it might look like this when you put it on the surface, by the time you put the matte medium on and let it dry, it's going to end up more like this. And where on the white background, where any of this white that you've torn disappears, on the black, it is very, very obvious. So you would have to take the time to fussy cut around the image to end up with a really good final result for this. So just to be aware of what happens when you try to use these on black. It's not the way I use them at all, but I wanted to show you an example just in case you felt like going that far with it. So I also wanted to show you what to do if you really wanted to add layers of this. So instead of having a perfectly smooth, nice image like we have on this page, I wanted to show you what you could do by adding textures and layers and adding wrinkles and other things to make this a lot more organic. It's really good if you want to paint on top or use other things on top where the texture underneath is something that you're looking for. So in this case, I'm not going to show nearly as much care, and I'm going to purposely let this wrinkle. So I'm going to throw it on. I'm going to purposely try to wrinkle this up. What's nice about this is if you use washes of other colors, if you use any sort of pastel, crayon, anything on it, you can end up with a really interesting result. So in that case, I already crinkled it, and now I'm adding it on. So you can get some pretty crazy crinkles if you choose to, or you can have much more subtle texture to this. It's really up to you and how far you want to go with things. And this is also where you could choose to layer these. They don't all have to go on just one way. The one thing to be careful of is, again, not to tear it too badly. I was realizing I was being, again, a little harsh with my brush there, instead of tearing a little bit of it. And you can put areas on top that, again, are more smooth. And they can actually overlap the areas that you've already put down that have all the wrinkles in them. And you can just continue to add this until your page is done, or you have as many layers on it as you want. So I want to finish up this video by showing you a couple examples of how to use napkins. In this case, I was creating a page that is pretty much all tissue, but you might notice here that there is actually a torn bit. It's fairly well hidden because of the pattern of it, but basically because the napkin was only so tall, I had to overlap and try to create this variety of trees. So because it's torn in a very subtle way, it's very hard to tell if there's layers in this particular page. It looks like one more entire scene. And once it's fully dried, then you can write on top of it, add journaling. This one I created a flap, but it's a very good way of just adding your napkins just as a background. So for this example, I used the same image as I used on this one where I originally showed you how to attach it to the page. This one is a much lighter color just because it's straight on white. Well, this one I ended up adding watercolor brushes to the background first and then added the tissue on top. And I really like the look of this. I like the vibrancy of the succulent plants in this. And I also added some washi tape, another image of a succulent, and some journaling as well. So there's many ways you can make these kind of the focal point of your piece, or it can be just a layer just to add a lot more texture and interest to your page. So here's another example of adding napkins and tissues to your page, but in this case I was added as part of the background. There's some florals in here and some florals in here, as well as some hearts in here. They're all part of napkins, and I used that as my base layer and then added in paint and stencils and washes and everything on top, and it adds texture, it adds interest, things peek through, but it isn't the main focal image. So again, there's multiple ways you can use these, lots of ways that you can add this to your creative journaling, just so that you end up with a lot of variation. So thanks for joining me today, and I hope this has given you some ideas on how to use napkins in your next creative project. And if you've enjoyed this video, if you could like it, subscribe, and hit that notification button so you don't miss out on any future videos. You can also view the supply list below. You can also see it on my website, hopalongstudio.com. There I have other ideas on how to build a creative habit in your own life, and I also include photo and written instructions for each of these tutorials. So I hope you have a really great week and that you take some time for some personal self-care. See you next time.